Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome to the SAC update for the first half of 2021. Thank you all for being here. I am joined by the wonderful members of the Scientific Advisory Council. And we decided, like we did last year at this time, that what we would do is we would go around the members of the SAC that were able to attend, have each person introduce themselves, because there may be some new attendees on the line who haven't had a chance to be introduced to the members. And it's always good to be a reminder for those who have met most of the members, again, the wonderful expertise that we have on this council. And then we'll just ask each person to maybe talk for a minute or two about something that they're excited about in current state of ALS research. We'll go to some Q&A, and if we run out of questions or if we need to tap dance in the middle, I have a lot of things that I'm excited about, and I'll just push those around to the members to talk about. So okay, without further ado, I think maybe we can go alphabetically, because there's no other, I have no other reason at the moment. So perhaps Louis, you could start and introduce yourself, and maybe just say something about what you're excited in 2021 for ALS research.
Okay, good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And my name is Luis Barbeito. I'm currently researcher at the Instituto Pasteur Montevideo in Uruguay, South America. And our group is currently working in the causes of ALS, in the pathogenic mechanisms, mainly the involvement of glial cells in the pathogenic mechanisms. We mainly work in preclinical models, in mouse and rat model of ALS. And of course, we also collaborate with clinicians here in the country and abroad. And we use post-mortem tissue from ALS patients to dissect our hypothesis about the involvement of glial cells. And lastly, we also working on drugs that could be used therapeutically in ALS. And we have done plenty of studies working on antioxidants, fatty acids, and also small synthetic molecules like tyrosine kinase inhibitors, like masitinib. And our last study has been related to a new generation of small drugs that blocks the inflammatory mechanisms in glial cells. So we have about 5 to 10 people working with us in the lab, and we, of course, are open to any collaboration in the frame of the ALS islands. Thank you.
And Louis, what's something you're excited about in 2021 in ALS research?
Okay, well, I think we have to divide in 3 or 4 aspects. One of them is the causes of ALS. Genetics is very important, of course, and we also hope to find new genetic mechanisms that could be solved, whether by genetic therapy, but also to better understand the mechanisms of disease. And then to dissect the different role of the cells involved in motor neuron degeneration, both in cortical and lower spinal cord, is spinal neuron, as well as in the periphery. And we are waiting for breakthrough results about the new mechanisms involving cells that finally could be targeted by drugs or by any other kind of therapeutical approach. And of course, most people and most clinicians in ALS are interested, are waiting for new biomarkers of disease, of course, that could be used for an early diagnosis and rapid treatment for ALS, and also for new therapeutical approaches that could cure the disease, or at least importantly delay the progression of the paralysis. And so we are waiting for new data in many different chapters that concern the disease. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving to Dr. Chio, Adriano.
Hi, I'm Adriano Chio. I am professor of neurology at the University of Turin, Italy, and I also chair the ALS Center here in our region. We are working on several aspects. In particular, the area that I'm more interested in is phenotypic heterogeneity of ALS from the different point of view, clinical, radiological, neuroimaging, and so on. And our research is toward the description of subgroups that can be the basis for the targeted therapies. And we think that this is an area that can be afforded now quite well, also using genetics, but genetics is not the only point to subdivide the patients in some way. So it is a multiple approach to the disease is the area that I'm interested. The other question you made is why we can be excited. I think we can be excited, first of all, because there are some possible therapies now, and the genetic therapy in this case is the most important. We really hope that the genetic therapy via antisense oligonucleotides can be an effective in some subgroup of ALS. But that's would be a very good message, even if it would interest only a minority of the patients. There is another area that is really rapidly evolving, is the research of biomarkers of the disease, both for diagnosis to improve diagnosis, and also in the area of improving the clinical trials. We know that clinical trials in ALS have a lot of problems, and we need really to improve that. And the third point is that there are now two platforms. One is in US with Merit Katkowitz, and the other is in Europe with the group in Utrecht, Leonard Vandenberg. And this is a new approach to therapy of ALS, very useful probably to make in parallel studies of different drugs, and to be able to sort out which can be promising for phase 3 clinical trials. So this is something that is very important for our patient, I think, because it's a possibility to be in different trials and different drugs. That's my point.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriano. Okay, now we're challenging my alphabetical skills. Kuldip, I believe it's you.
It's me. Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. Kuldip Dave, Vice President of Research at the ALS Association in the United States. David, you asked us what are we excited about, and what I'm excited about is this idea of prevention in ALS. We don't, it's sort of a new concept for our disease and ecosystem in that the idea that we can use therapies to prevent someone from getting ALS, and the concept that if you knew someone's genetic status and you had a genetic therapy against that gene, that you could start treating them even before symptoms show up. And this is really a novel concept. It's something that, as you may have heard, Biogen is currently testing in their ATLAS trial with the drug tofersen. So this is the idea that people with SOD1 mutations that don't have the disease, if they're treated prior to symptoms, which you prevent or delay when the symptoms actually show up. And I think that is really sort of innovative, and frankly, if it works, a breakthrough for prevention that we've not generally seen in even neurodegenerative diseases, let alone ALS. So I'm really excited about that concept. The prevention is, in that context, in that trial, is important, but prevention in general, if we can find risk factors, if we can find other genes, we can start to develop these prevention trials in the future. Thank you, David.
Calder, before we move to Caroline, perhaps you might elaborate for everyone how they, in the ATLAS trial, because someone was going to mention ATLAS on this panel for sure, how are they going to determine what the trigger is for when to start tofersen on or placebo in the trial? And then maybe could you elaborate on when someone's on a placebo, when they would get switched to a actual treatment, how it's set up that way to be thoughtful about, someone who's just diagnosed with ALS and would receive tofersen, should it work, which we still have to wait and find out for sure.
Yeah, so the way the trial is set up is, so a couple of years ago, Dr. Michael Benatar down in Miami had shown that he was following in a cohort of people that had SOD1 mutations but had not developed the disease yet or not have symptoms. In scientific terms, we call them asymptomatic carriers. And he was following these asymptomatic carriers and looking at biomarkers that are changing prior to the disease or prior to diagnosis of ALS. And what he found was that what Dr. Benatar found and published now in a couple of papers is that there's a particular biomarker, NFL, that seems to increase about, give or take, about 12 months prior to disease diagnosis, and that is David, what the trial is using now to they're following a group of asymptomatic carriers, and the trigger is this increase in a particular above the threshold of this biomarker NFL, which will then have sort of trigger this, whether they get on drug or placebo. The second question, David, I'm not, I don't want to speculate because I'm not exactly sure how the study is set up. So maybe if someone else on the panel knows that better.
I mean, we're moving to Caroline. She might know. I think it was more just aimed at the fact that if tofersen works and someone was to be diagnosed with ALS, if that became something that would be prescribed for them, then when they're on, how could you let them go further than that with a placebo? So if someone's randomized to placebo, I believe once they would actually receive a clinical diagnosis of ALS, they are switched on to active tofersen, because that's obviously the ethical sort of piece there. But that way they still have a measure of placebo versus people on tofersen who are randomized upstream of diagnosis. I think that's what it is, but I only say that because someone might be alarmed to think if tofersen works, you'd be on placebo for a while, would be very difficult to.
Yeah, David. No, I agree with you. And this is why I say this is new, right? Because there are ethics of these types of trials that we have to consider, and I think companies have to think about as to how they would handle once that, diagnosis of what we call phenoconversion happens. How do you handle that? So it's that's what my understanding was too, David, but hopefully Caroline or others may be able to add to this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kuldip. And now moving to Caroline.
Well, thank you. Very nice to be here. And so I'll start with introducing myself, and then I'll follow up with your questions. So My name is Caroline Ingre, and I'm a researcher and an ALS clinician at the Karolinska University Hospital in Stockholm, Sweden. And I also do research in the ALS area around epidemiological studies around risk and prognosis, and also biomarker studies, and also do some imaging, as Adriana was talking about, other type of biomarkers. And so I think that this is a really interesting question. And I also think that one of the interesting questions is also if we need to reassess what an ALS diagnosis is built of, because now we have a progressive weakness. And if we are getting biomarkers now that will tell us when a patient is actually sick with the disease before the clinical onset, then maybe we have to be able to give a person a diagnosis before the weakness is as prominent and progressive that it is right now. So I think this is a very, very interesting question, when to start treating the at-risk individuals, and when is the actual phenoconversion happening, and on what grounds, on the biomarker or the clinical grounds. So that's something that needs to be, I think, discussed around when both wet and dry biomarkers will be stronger and will show us of the ALS disease. So I think that's a very interesting question to talk about. But I also think that when you're in a clinical trial, usually it's, as you say, David, when you are followed in the trial, you have a very close connection with the clinicians. So whenever a person gets symptoms which look like a disease, you will get kind of a fast track investigation. And so you will be closely monitoring those patients to be able to pick up when they actually get ALS. And I don't know exactly how the clinical trial is set up, but so I can't really say anything more about the setup of the trial, but I'm sure that it's been considered in a very ethical way, of course, and otherwise it wouldn't have been or wouldn't be approved. So I think that we can be safe to say that the safe way for the patient is always our first priority, right? Even if we really, really want to find out the pathophysiology and about the phenoconversion and when it happens, and if we can find it before, so that we can prevent the disease from spreading, of course. But I have to say something else. I really liked everyone's aspect of what they're interested in 2021. But I need to say something for my region, for the Nordic regions. So what I'm really excited about now and for the next coming years is that we are gathering, we're kind of putting our forces together, both Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark, and are trying to and Iceland, trying to talk more and meet more and interact more, and also let patients from the other countries come to clinical trials if that clinical trial is not happening in that specific country. So we're trying to work over the borders, more like a Nordic countries set up for ALS patients. And since this is a rare disease and all centers in every country can't do clinical trials for everyone, I think this is a very exciting time. So maybe we can have this precision medicine thinking by allowing patients with specific phenotypes or subgroups to come to another country to be included in a clinical trial. So I'm very excited about that possibility and to start to work with that from now on.
Thank you, Caroline. And my name is David Taylor. I'm the Vice President of Research for the ALS Society of Canada. Gethin, just because I'm the chair does not mean I go last or anything. We're all even here, so I learned out the alphabet this time. This just brought up a spark, what Caroline said, of something that I am kind of excited about. That's a really fast thing, which is that the new Amylyx trial that will start later this year, the phase 3 Phoenix trial, will be a collaboration between TriCals and NEALS, which I also think is really exciting from just a very high level, because here you have the two biggest, probably most powerful networks for running clinical trials in ALS in the world collaborating on a single trial. And there are certainly multinational clinical trials that have happened before where the sites have been involved, but in terms of the two networks being on the same sort of trial, I think is really exciting. And I don't want, I mean, obviously there's two TriCals experts here, so I would let them speak to that more when we get further on. But that, when you said that about the certain countries working borderless, that sparked to me. If I said really quickly what I think I'm excited about, I have a number of things, but one of the things I am excited about for 2021 is hopefully and I'm not sure what the full status is, but should we get the very first readouts of the C9orf72 ASO at the same time as getting more C9orf72 targeted treatments into that last step or hurdle of getting into clinical trial, where I think we might start to get the first inklings as to whether or not this is treatable by knocking down this particular gene, because I think in preclinical sense, it's still a little confusing as to what the best way to tackle this is, but it's a significant number of people living with ALS. And now for the first time, we're going to start to see human data in terms of manipulation of C9orf72. So I'm kind of excited to see how that translates, even though they're small trials and they're early days, from lab to clinic, in a similar way to what we started to see with tofersen for tackling SOD at the human level, which obviously I'm not saying that those will be necessarily comparable, but I think that that's exciting that we'll finally start to get some human treatment data from C9orf72, even if small, and many more coming, many strategies coming, I think, to trial in the years ahead. Okay, and I'll stop talking and move on to Gethin.
Thank you, David, and it's great to be here. Thank you for everyone for coming along. My name is Gethin Thomas, and I'm the Director of Research for MND Australia. In Australia, we have a federated organisation, so we have the states that really have oversight of the care directly to the patients, and MND Australia, we have a more centralised role of, we centralise the research funding, advocacy, and we also provide a framework to allow all the states to work together, and other national corporations, and also partnerships, international partnerships such as with the Alliance and PACTLs. So I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle, because obviously we've been hearing about all these fantastic treatments that are hopefully going to come to fruition in the next year or two. And what hopefully that will mean is that we'll have patients living with MND for longer. And that brings into, I think, quality of life becomes a really key issue then. One real core aspect of quality of life is communication. And there's some fantastic research going on at the moment in improving the ability of patients to communicate. We have at the moment eye gaze technology and voice banking, which a few years ago would have been thought to be science fiction, space age stuff, but now is pretty much run of the mill. But now there's a lot more research coming in now to really boost these technologies. So we've got like Google, Amazon, Microsoft bringing in their AI abilities to improve our predictive text for people when they're using eye gaze. So it's just much faster, you know, we all think that Google knows everything about everything we do. Well, if you're an MND patient, perhaps that's a good thing to let you use your eye gaze technology a bit better. The next step up from that, from eye gaze, is now becoming brain-computer interfaces. So previously, these have been, you know, you've had to actually implant electrodes into people's brains, which is obviously incredibly invasive. I'm going to be a bit of a plug here for an Australian development called Stentrode, where they've actually developed a stent with an electrode inside it that they can actually feed in through your jugular vein into the vein sitting on top of your brain, and that then allows you to, they're just undertaking a clinical trial at the moment. They've shown that patients which have this stentrode embedded in their veins can actually control computers. So they can control mice, a mouse on a computer, and they've shown these guys can do their online banking, they can order things online, emails, etc. So it's really boosted their communication skills. And if you take this to the further degree, you've got people who be able to drive wheelchairs, control feeding devices, perhaps in the far future, even control something like an exoskeleton. And this is all by the power of thought. And that to me is completely can completely change how people live with this disease. And then the next stage is that now they're improving the algorithms to actually translate those thoughts as well. So they got for handwriting, for typing, they're saying instead of actually picturing the letters, patients can now imagine moving their hand as if they were writing, and that will actually then translate directly to text with something like I think I read somewhere 94% accuracy, which is remarkable. So I think this is going to be a real key aspect as these new treatments come in. We'll have patients living with the disease, and it's really important that we make that life as good as possible. So thank you.
That's wonderful. A wonderful ending there of the roundtable piece. So I should have said to everyone, please always do submit questions if you have any into the chat. I don't see any at the moment, although it says that the Q&A, oh, sorry, they are here. It's a separate button. So in the second half, would like to get into the questions. So there's a first question, which was, does COVID-19 have a significant effect on fundraising in other countries as well? So I'm not sure if the panel will know the answer in terms, well, some people will perhaps. How do they cope with it? Best practices. Has COVID-19 slowed down the progress in trials? What is the long-term effect on research? Estimate how many patient years are lost? Is it a minor effect? And then something about the Orphazyme trial. Okay, so maybe we just, does anyone want to speak about where the research field is at with regard to COVID, and maybe in a more general sense, how COVID has affected the research community or not affected it in certain ways?
I can certainly talk to Australia. We've obviously been a lot more fortunate than many places in the world. Our research certainly probably slowed down for about 3 months when people were pretty much locked out of the labs. But that time was well used by people to analyze data, write up experiments. So I'd say we probably lost a couple of months in Australia, but it's not too bad. The clinical trials, most of them actually carried on. The neurologists and clinicians were fantastic in pivoting to telehealth. So a few of the more invasive, I think, clinical trials were put on hold, such as spinal injections, etc. But a lot of the trials that are already underway, a lot of the follow-up of the trials was done through telemedicine as well, and our clinics have been fantastic with that. Fundraising definitely took a hit. Many events couldn't be held, but again, a lot of the donors were incredible and still gave money anyway, even though it wasn't through an event. So we definitely had a slight downfall in fundraising, but it wasn't anywhere near the really cataclysmic effects we were scared of for a while. So as per usual, everyone knows how generous the community are, and we really saw that. Everyone's having their own problems with COVID, etc., losing jobs, businesses, but people still found those resources to support us, and we're incredibly grateful for that.
Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Well, the experience in Italy is quite good from the point of view of clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic, because we could prolong our studies, and we could also recruit patients during this period, even if we had some problems with the ordinary clinics that were partly substituted with the web visits. All the patients were still in the trial, and we recruited. So it was a particular permission we had from the hospital.
Great, thank you. And I guess if no one else wants to say anything, I guess maybe what I would ask is, does anyone feel that at this point they're not moving along quite well in terms of the research and has adapted? Does anyone feel that it is? My feeling is that the field is adapted pretty well and is humming along at a pretty good pace. And I think people should still feel very hopeful that it has not significantly hampered us the way we might have thought a year ago it was going to, or could have potentially. And so there's a piece of hope. I think that, you know, we've weathered it very well, and now starting to see globally more optimism in terms of coming back to in-person things, which actually I think is going to be wonderful, because people are really going to value being in person with their colleagues and having in-person meetings again, because of the value that brings in the informal communications that happen versus just being able to talk on a webinar with each other. So that's just my throw in there. Okay, so this one's going to be directed at Caroline, I think. It's a question from Gudjon about where can the Icelandic individuals who are diagnosed with ALS have an opportunity to participate in trials, and would Sweden adopt them?
No, but I'm really happy for this question, because so this is exactly what we're working on, and I can very happy to tell you, Gudjon, that we are working with the Icelandic hospital and with administrative personnel from Karolinska to make this work on a higher level. And then we have also, when we do applications for clinical trials now in Sweden, or at least here at Karolinska, we always apply for other Nordic countries' participation. So we have decided to do the consent forms in Swedish and English. And so that's the only rule we have, that you have to be able to speak Swedish or English, so that we can have the consent form and every correspondence in English or Swedish. But other than that, we're working very hard to be able to include patients also from Iceland. And specifically with Iceland, we're working with the hospitals themselves to make this happen. And with the other Nordic countries, we're also working with patient organizations. And they're also gathering money to be able to, if there is higher cost for travel for patients who are from the other countries, and the pharmaceutical companies can only reimburse so much, there would be money in those countries to reimburse the patients for the extra costs. So we're really trying to do everything we can to accept patients from all the other countries. So it's really, really very hopeful future for collaboration between Nordic countries. A very transparent situation. And I have been invited to talk at the national ALS meetings in the other Nordic countries to kind of inform about what we are doing, and also to get to know the other clinicians. So we're really trying to interact, and we're also working with newsletters and updates from our site, so that this will be much easier to track for patients from the Nordic country. Of course, anywhere else as well, but at least for the Nordic countries. So just hang in there, and we're trying to fix it and to invite patients also from Iceland.
That's really exciting. And sounds like an answer that I think Gudjon will be very glad to hear. So thank you for that, Caroline. Okay, we have another question about the possibility for essentially remote participation in trials. And I think that this is a question that is obviously very topical, given the pandemic and things people are thinking a lot about. I know, and I will open it for anyone that would like to answer that. I know that the US does have a completely remote trial going on of theracurmin. It's a curcumin based through Duke University, Richard Bedlack's ALS reversals initiative, but I'm sure there are many adaptations. I see Adriano's come off mute that are being worked on to be able to help make trials more remote for people living with ALS MND. So I will pass the floor over to Adriano.
No, yeah, just to say that the design of the phase 3 trial for the Amylyx is based on visits in the clinic, and the second visit is remote and so on. And there is also the possibility to have nurses going to the house of the patients, and then to have the observation there. So something that is in between, but in this way, the patient have to go to the center only once every 4 months, which is not so much. A little better than before, that they have to come every 2 months. Probably the regulatory authorities do not want have clinical trials that will be for registration of drugs totally made on with telemedicine visits, but the idea is to go to that way.
And I guess I don't know if Culdip has any extra on this as well. Oh, Louis, I'm not sure if you were off mute for to say anything. Okay, but there's also been a number of pieces of work around the world to try to better understand how we can measure at home things. So Jeremy Scheffner and Siewert Rutkov had an ALS at home study that went quite deep into measuring aspects. A lot of the big data initiatives have some form of wearables, and then I know that the Utrecht group had done a number of at-home measurements of ALS-FRS and other things. So it's an advancing field for sure. I think Culdip looks like he's ready to say something, but am I wrong?
No, thank you, David. Since you mentioned me, just maybe mention that you know, this is where we want to get to. The subjective nature of an ALS-FRS type scale, where you have to go in and the doctor determines a number on that scale, and there's nothing wrong in that scale. That is what we have now. But I think, as David is mentioning and others did, that we need to start to validate these other outcome measures, whether they're digital wearable devices and things like that, that can be more objective and more telemedicine friendly, so that or remote monitoring friendly. And so this is, you know, what's happening, I think, across the world. For example, the ALS Association is currently supporting a study where patients are going in every 6 months to do their sort of normal, get their normal ALS-FRS scores and progression of the disease. But in between, there are digital devices that are capturing what's happening between each of those measurements, and so that, and then all of that data is sort of captured in the portal, in the cloud, and being analyzed. And I think it's things like this that will help get to what Gudjon is asking around remote monitoring and telemedicine. Once we are able to validate these measures, I think they can be used in that way.
Great. Okay, is anyone, maybe what we'll do then is we'll actually, this is a great segue. So the questions are being set up well into good discussion from Jessica about also including South America in clinical trials. And it brings to mind for me a discussion that happened between the Patient and Caregiver Advisory Council and some members of the Scientific Events Advisory Council about a week ago, where Adriano and Caroline were actually talking about the capacity in the current trial sites that exist and the sheer number, which is incredibly exciting as well, of trials that are coming forward, which is also an indication of our advancing and our learning and understanding of how ALS is happening so that we have better targets. And so there will be possibly a need to start to educate and advance trial sites in other areas that are under service for trials at the moment. Does anyone want to speak to that, or do you want me to keep tap dancing about it? I guess essentially, oh, well, maybe Lewis could speak to the need for trials in something in South America. Anyways, I think that from what I've heard, well, we certainly know that there are, close to 100 companies or possibly more now who are invested in clinical development of some targets in ALS. And so when you can imagine that the current sites have so much on their plates right now, there may be a need to start looking at other areas to start to recruit, and that will obviously require engagement with some of those groups. So I think perhaps if the field can start to reach out to the the network of South American clinicians or the advocacy groups, perhaps there's ways eventually we can learn to evolve those sites into clinical trial sites, and then that would become possibly an attractive place as they build up their abilities for companies to be able to recruit effectively. So I don't know if I'm saying anything wrong, then I look to the clinicians to tell me, because I am not a clinician. But in terms of answering that question, I think there's certainly a hope that we can start to bring trials to a wider area of the earth and to countries that do not have access to them. And with so many trials coming forward, the opportunities are there. Yeah.
David, I would completely support your view, and this is why I'm trying to find ways to approach our neurologists in, for example, in South American regions, or clinicians or clinical centers to the ALS field, because they are completely isolated, and that's a problem. I think that our region has a lot of opportunities, a great potential to further study ALS, but since most of the clinicians are quite isolated from the mainstream, they cannot even think about applying for a clinical trial. And this is a matter that the islands could really help in creating an approach, sensibilization, training, why not, to make or to make possible these changes.
And I wonder if maybe mentorship from those who understand how you could maybe leverage research infrastructure from, say, if there was a clinic that had trials in another indication or another disease, could you leverage some time for a research coordinator to do one trial, or mentorship in terms of what would be required by the societies to help fundraise to be able to put infrastructure into a site because obviously a clinician alone can't do this without a support of a research team. And so the first step, I guess, is understanding what's needed, and as you said, connecting to them. So it's something that maybe would be really great to have a further discussion on, which is how to help expand trial ready sites outside of the current. And obviously, I mean, things like what Caroline is doing and what TRICALS is doing is helping to do that. But then thinking about those places that are probably beyond their immediate reach to sort of get to the point where eventually they can all come together in a more collaborative way. Okay, so if There is a question from Hort Jan. He wanted to ask about the current update on stem cell therapy and Brainstorm. I'm not sure if anyone wants to go into that. I mean, I can say very quickly, there was the presentation of results that were there showed that 32 of 95 individuals on NurOwn had a slope change on their progression rate of what they said was at least 1.25 points per month. 27 of 94 individuals on placebo, which is no stem cells, which is just the medium that they are put in, also had that effect. And in a pre-designed subgroup, there were 9 people out of 30 something, 32 that had that as well, and 5 people on placebo. So when the results come out, which I believe the Brainstorm has applied or has submitted a paper, as they've said on social media, we would have more information. But I think from a scientific point of view, there seems to be at least with statistics, it is difficult to determine at this point a difference between the placebo and the NurOwn. However, we wait to see full data to be able to fully interpret what's happening. And no one wants to tackle that one, I will say, usually, but maybe Kuldip will. Okay.
Yeah, David. So, you know, but with NurOwn, I think it's interesting because there are sort of 3 narratives out there. And I think in each of these cases, the company needs to provide more data and more transparency around this. The first narrative is this narrative we see on the internet with people with ALS doing amazing things, appearing to have some restoration of function. These videos are inspiring. And in that situation, Brainstorm needs to do a couple of things. One, they need to release the data in a confidential way, you know, by listing the number of people who showed some restoration of function and indicating if those unnamed individuals were receiving treatment or placebo. And you know, this is important because restoration of function is very, very rare. And if it's happening, people need to know. We need to know. It's a huge breakthrough for neuroscience. And so, you know, that's the first narrative. The second narrative is what you talked about, David. This what was in the press release and what the company has put out, that 32% of people that were given NurOwn were responding, whereas 27.7% of people on placebo were scored as responders, and that was not statistically significant. However, the data showed that there were some biomarker changes. And so again, in this case, Brainstorm needs to put data out that shows how these biomarkers are related to clinical outcomes. Are they somehow, are the biomarkers somehow telling us about the mechanism of the drug, or is it telling us about how the disease is functioning? So I think hopefully the publication that they're going to put out will address that. And then the third narrative is what the FDA put out. Remember, the FDA did a very unusual statement. They never generally talk about experimental therapies, but they provided a rare glimpse into NurOwn, where the FDA also stated that there was no difference in efficacy, but that there was a modest excess in depth in those treated with NurOwn, the significance of which is unclear at this time. That was FDA's comment. And this is the first time that we have all heard about a potential safety concern related to NurOwn. And again, in this case, Brainstorm has to release data to either support or refute this concern that the FDA has raised. So, you know, in all 3 situations, I think we hope that the company is able to clarify, you know, there shouldn't be 3 narratives. This is not a fictional story. This is science. There should be only one one narrative and one set of scientific results. And we have 3 different results here. And so I think the company, it would be great if the company could start to resolve these 3 narratives.
I think that's a great point, that, you know, the ball is in Brainstorm's court at this point in terms of how we move forward. And they have the point data, they have the ability to unblind, and they have the ability to help resolve some of these questions that are out there for better clarification, so that when people ask, we have a better understanding of how to answer the question effectively. Because what I stated was really all we have, but it's possible that there's the devil's in the details, and so we really need that information, and the ball is in their court as to how this moves forward. Yeah, I guess the other question was about stem cells in general. I don't know, there are still stem cell trials that are happening. One of the ones that, you know, people do go to South Korea sometimes for NeuroNADA-R is actually in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial now, which I think is a valuable thing to be able to explore whether this is an effective therapy in Korea. And then I think there are a number of trials happening around. I would say my thinking is that there's still some belief there's a possibility that it does something, but it is not the primary thought process for most scientists and clinicians in terms of the way that we're tackling at least what you can see is when we talk about what we're most excited about, it doesn't come back to that every time. So I think it's a matter of we still have to learn a lot, and we need more information. But again, as always, if someone corrects me, please do. Okay, so we also have a question about speeding up procedures for approving medicine by FDA, EMA, or any other country's regulatory bodies by using the methods for COVID vaccinations. Does anyone have any information or anything about how, I mean, I think it was a unique world crisis that led to prioritization of COVID vaccinations that every disease area will be looking to try to compare to for their regulatory approvals and reimbursements in their countries. Hopefully we can push urgency on ALS. I'm not sure if anyone wants to speak to that. Otherwise, I know that one of the questions that we get in Canada often is how can we get more harmonization where regulatory bodies could work together as they do in cancer in some ways to co-approve things. And again, I look to the clinicians as to whether this is wrong, but I think one of the key aspects in ALS that's still lacking compared to cancer trials and other ones is objective ways to measure efficacy, and they're still quite subjective, which means that you're going to have regulatory bodies that may disagree on the efficacy of a particular therapy, whereas if you had something more objective, it would be easier to look at them harmonizing and speeding up an international or collaborative approval of therapies. And that's a challenge that ALS has to meet that was already spoken about, which is the more we get more objective biomarkers and the more we get ways to measure the disease in a way that's less subjective, FDA, EMA, all of these regulatory bodies might be able to do some level of collaboration in the future. So anyways, I don't know. I just don't see anyone volunteering to speak. So I'm speaking on that. Okay, we have other questions in the last 5 minutes. Following on Jess's question and comments by Caroline and Lewis, would it not be possible for larger, better funded trial bodies to find satellite sites in places like South America? And then actually on that, do the platform trials, the Magnet and the Healy work closely together. Does anyone want to speak to that? Or is there a potential for TriCals to start looking at sites outside of Europe? We don't have any NEALS representatives.
I think TriCals, one of their trials is at least going to be partially run in Australia. I think the lithium trial is there's going to be some sites in Australia. That's partly due to some funding coming into that trial from Australian fundraisers. So I think there is scope for that. I mean, I don't know how that would. I think that obviously was helped by those funds coming in. So perhaps if some of those countries can contribute some funding to the trials, and that obviously puts you in a much better position, though obviously some countries are in better positions than others to actually support trials like that.
I think I'm muted, sorry. I think they'll shake their head either way, but I think at this point it's too early days for Magnet and Healy to have that kind of collaborative spirit just yet. Like the spirit's there, but there's no formal collaborations, correct? I believe it's still, there's still such early days for those.
David, I do think that while it is early days for them to collaborate or, you know, kind of, but I think they could learn from each other as time goes. You know, Healy, just like we talked about the prevention trial earlier, the platform trials are brand new to our disease and our ecosystem, and we don't know, you know, operationally, you know, how well the platform trial will work or platform trials work in ALS. You know, how many drugs is too much? Does at some point, does the trial kind of, you know, operationally get so difficult because there are just so many treatments all at once in the trial? I mean, there are these sort of operational questions that we, you know, only time will tell what will happen. And so if the platform trial goes ahead and looks like they can handle 5 drugs at the same time, or they could handle 8 drugs at the same time, then the Magnet trial learns from the Healy trial and vice versa. And so I do think that that kind of cross-learning will be very important down the line.
Well, we are at 7:59 and I'm mindful of everyone's time, but hopefully everyone can see that there is a lot going on in a lot of areas. The ALS field it continues to move forward. There's a lot of hope, a lot of excitement, a lot of trials coming off, a lot of learnings at the preclinical level as well. And so I think it was a great ending there in the idea that we are furthering and furthering collaboration globally, and more communication between everyone, even in a remote world, so it can only get better as we start to get back in person. So thank you to all the members of the SAC for being here today. Thank you to all of the Alliance members who are here to watch. I will try to look through the questions afterwards. We can continue at the SAC to make sure the answers are given to those questions that weren't addressed, and wishing everyone a good rest of the day, no matter how long that is. And if you have other questions, we're here. So please funnel those through the Alliance, and I know Hort-Jan will make sure we get them. That's what we're here for as an SAC. So it's a privilege to be on this council. And thanks again to everyone for being here. Have a great day.